Picture this: your fingers brush against the cracked leather binding of a journal untouched for centuries, its pages whispering secrets from an age of knights and castles. Hidden away in the shadowy corners of a remote monastery, this wasn't just any old book. It was the personal chronicle of a 13th century knight, a man who lived by a code so profound, so deeply honorable, that its rediscovery would rewrite everything we thought we knew about chivalry. Today, we're stepping into his world, unearthing the lost virtues that defined knighthood, and discovering why these ancient ideals still echo in our modern lives. This isn't just a story about parchment and ink. It's a window into a time when a knight's word was his bond, when loyalty and courage weren't just ideals but a way of life. The journal's pages reveal more than battles and alliances. They expose a hidden system of honor, a moral compass that guided knights through chaos and betrayal. But here's the twist: these principles weren't just for the battlefield. They were meant to shape every aspect of a knight's existence, from how he treated the lowest peasant to how he faced his own failures. And the most astonishing part, this code wasn't some lofty myth. It was real, practiced in secret, passed down in hushed tones until it vanished, swallowed by time. So how did this journal survive when so much of history was lost? And what can its teachings tell us about the true meaning of honor? As we trace its journey from a medieval scriptorium to the hands of modern historians, we'll decode the knight's own words, piece together the rituals he followed, and explore why these forgotten virtues still hold power today. This is more than a history lesson. It's an invitation to rediscover what it means to live with purpose, to stand by your word, and to find strength in principles that have weathered 800 years. The Knight's Journal isn't just a relic, it's a mirror asking us one timeless question: what kind of legacy will you leave behind? The crumbling abbey stood silent for centuries, its stone walls guarding more than just the prayers of long-forgotten monks. In the early 1900s, a historian sifting through dust-covered manuscripts in its neglected library made a discovery that would send ripples through our understanding of the medieval world. His fingers trembled as he pulled free a leather-bound volume, its spine stiff with age but its pages remarkably intact. The handwriting was meticulous, each stroke of ink deliberate, as if the writer knew his words might one day speak across the ages. Carbon dating would later confirm what the historian's gut already whispered. This was no ordinary ledger or religious text. It was the personal journal of a knight from the 1200s, a voice from the past preserved against all odds. What makes this find so extraordinary isn't just its age, but its intimacy. Official chronicles of the time recorded battles and treaties, kings and conquests, grand events meant for public memory. But these pages held the unguarded thoughts of a man navigating the weight of his vows, the tension between faith and sword, the quiet moments of doubt that never made it into songs or tapestries. Here, in faded ink, were midnight reflections on what it truly meant to be honorable when no one was watching. The knight wrote of struggling to show mercy to a defeated enemy, of the shame he carried after losing his temper with a squire, even of the guilt he felt for craving glory on the battlefield when his code demanded humility. These weren't the polished ideals of chivalry recited in courts. They were the raw, lived experiences of a man trying to live up to them, and yet the journal's survival is its own kind of miracle. Wars raged, monasteries burned, time eroded parchment into dust. So how did this one fragile book endure? The answer lies with the monks who sheltered it. Recognizing its value, they hid it away like a sacred relic, passing it down in secret through generations of abbey keepers. They knew these words mattered, not just as history, but as a testament to something timeless, the struggle to align action with principle. Today, as historians painstakingly translate each stained page, we're not just recovering lost details of medieval life, we're reclaiming a conversation about honor that's as urgent now as it was 8 centuries ago. Because the knight's deepest question wasn't how to wield a sword, it was how to wield himself. Sir Geoffrey de Montclair was no Lancelot or Galahad. No songs celebrated his deeds, no troubadours immortalized his name in verse. Yet this obscure knight from the 1200s left us something far more precious than legend, his unvarnished truth. Born into a minor noble family in northern France, Geoffrey rose not through fame or favor, but through quiet dedication to his lord and his faith. His journal reveals a man constantly wrestling with the gap between the knightly ideal and messy reality. After one brutal skirmish during the 7th Crusade, he confesses trembling hands as he cleans blood from his sword, writing, "A true knight should feel sorrow before victory, yet my heart still races with the heat of battle." God forgive this pride. What sets Geoffrey apart from his more celebrated contemporaries is his startling vulnerability. Where chronicles of the time depict knights as paragons of unwavering courage, his pages expose the human beneath the armor. He agonizes over sending young squires into their first battles, questions whether his lord's political maneuvers align with Christian virtues, even admits envy when rivals receive honors he believes he earned. In one poignant entry, he describes comforting a dying enemy soldier, a Saracen teenager, and realizing, "This boy's mother will weep as mine would. What holy war justifies such grief?" These weren't the thoughts of a perfect warrior, but of a deeply moral man navigating an imperfect world. Geoffrey's battlefield accounts shatter Hollywood stereotypes of medieval warfare. His descriptions of the siege of Damietta in 1249 don't glorify combat, they detail the stench of siege trenches, the agony of infected wounds, the way noble knights looted peasant homes when supply lines failed. Yet amid this brutality, he documents small acts of unexpected grace, sharing his cloak with a shivering prisoner, intervening when drunken soldiers harassed local women, even persuading his commander to spare a village that had sheltered enemies. The greatest test of knighthood, he writes, comes not when all eyes watch, but when none do save God. Historians now recognize Geoffrey's journal as a Rosetta Stone for understanding authentic chivalric values. While official codes like the Ordine de Chivalry presented polished ideals for public consumption, Geoffrey's private writings show how those principles were tested daily. His lifelong struggle wasn't against dragons or sorcerers, but against his own flaws, pride, anger, despair. That's what makes these pages so extraordinary. 8 centuries later, we don't just see a knight, we see ourselves. Buried within those weathered pages lies a revelation that turns our modern notions of knighthood upside down. Geoffrey's code wasn't about jousting trophies or courtly love. It was a rigorous daily discipline, a series of quiet choices that defined a man far from the tournament fields. Take his entry from the winter of 1243, where he recounts stopping his retinue to help peasants dig a cart from the mud. A true knight's spurs, he writes, should gleam with service as much as battle. This wasn't performative charity. It was a radical belief that honor began with seeing the humanity in those society rendered invisible. What makes his system so startlingly modern is its rejection of absolutes. While official chivalric codes demanded unwavering loyalty to one's lord, Geoffrey wrestles with moral dilemmas in real time. After witnessing his liege order the burning of a rebellious village, he writes, "Can obedience be virtuous if it fans cruelty? I carried the torch but not the conviction." His solution, a hierarchical yet deeply personal ethic, serve your lord faithfully, but when orders clash with conscience, intervene discreetly, sabotaging supply wagons to delay an unjust attack or secretly warning villagers of impending raids. This wasn't rebellion, it was what he called the higher obedience, answering to divine justice over human whim. The journal's most revolutionary passages dismantle the myth of knighthood as mere martial prowess. Geoffrey devotes pages to mastering not just swordplay, but conflict resolution techniques we'd now call mediation. During a feud between two noble houses, he describes how he brokered peace not through force, but by isolating shared grievances. Hunger makes enemies of neighbors when the granaries are hoarded. His code demanded economic justice too, pressuring local lords to lower taxes after poor harvests. Strength, in his view, wasn't measured in how many men you could overpower, but in how many you could lift up. Perhaps the most poignant departure from romanticized chivalry is his treatment of failure. Where Arthurian legends hide their heroes' flaws, Geoffrey's journal catalogues his moral stumbles with painful honesty. After striking a servant in anger, he details his self-imposed penance, not grand gestures, but the humbling work of serving in that same servant's household for a fortnight. A knight's armor should chafe when worn unworthily, he reflects. This emphasis on accountability over image, on making amends rather than masking missteps, reveals an ethical framework startlingly relevant today. Historians now recognize these pages as evidence of a parallel tradition, what scholars call the Grey Code. While official chivalry was black and white in its rules, this practical philosophy thrived in the shadows, passed mentor to squire like trade secrets of the soul. It acknowledged human complexity, offering flexible principles for navigating impossible choices. When Geoffrey writes, "Better a stained cloak than a stained oath," he's not excusing compromise, but honoring the courage required to do partial good in an imperfect world. 8 centuries later, that tension still resonates, the eternal challenge of holding to your ideals while living in the real. Truth wasn't just a virtue in Geoffrey's world, it was the bedrock everything else stood upon. The very first page of his journal bears an inscription so stark it feels like a challenge. "Better to lose lands than to loose lies from thy tongue." For this 13th century knight, honesty wasn't situational or strategic, it was sacred. He recounts a moment when his lord mistakenly credited him for a battlefield victory he didn't earn. While others might have basked in the glory, Geoffrey publicly corrected the record, knowing full well it could cost him favor. "A knight's word," he wrote afterward, "must be as solid as castle stone, for when it crumbles, so too does the trust that binds men." What makes this principle so striking is how often it clashed with the political realities of his time. Medieval courts thrived on flattery and half-truths, yet Geoffrey's entries reveal a man who refused to play the game. When a wealthy merchant offered him a chest of silver to overlook illegal tolls collected from pilgrims, his refusal was absolute. "Let my purse starve before my conscience does." Even more revealing is how he applied this standard inward. After giving faulty directions that delayed his patrol, he didn't blame the rain or his squire. He stood before his men and admitted the error. A lie of omission, he noted that night, is still a lie, and corrosion begins unseen. Modern readers might assume such rigidity would make Geoffrey an outcast, but the opposite proved true. His journal details how even rivals sought him as an arbitrator in disputes, trusting his fairness over their own allies. A vassal's boundary quarrel, a disputed inheritance, even the delicate matter of a broken betrothal, all landed in his care because both sides knew his judgment wouldn't bend. This wasn't naivety, it was a calculated understanding that credibility, once lost, was near impossible to regain. "Men forgive a misplaced sword stroke," he observed, "but never a deliberate falsehood." The echoes between Geoffrey's code and today's ethical dilemmas are impossible to ignore. Corporate whistleblowers, scientific integrity, even social media authenticity, all grapple with the same core tension he faced: short-term gain versus lasting honor. His solution, a practice he called the morning mirror, staring at his reflection each dawn while reciting his sworn oaths, not as empty ritual, but as a visceral reminder that every choice would eventually stare back at him. 8 centuries later, in a world drowning in spin and half-truths, that unflinching commitment to truth feels less like medieval relic and more like urgent wisdom. Because when Geoffrey wrote, "A kingdom built on lies will fall faster than one built on sand," he wasn't just describing his era, he was speaking to ours. Courage in Geoffrey's world wasn't measured by the number of enemies felled on the battlefield. It was tested in the quiet moments when no one was watching. One chilling entry from 1252 describes how he intercepted a band of mercenaries preying on refugees fleeing a flooded village. Sword drawn but unused, he stood between the desperate families and their would-be tormentors, not with threats but with a simple challenge: strike me first if your honor allows it. The journal captures the taut silence that followed, the way the mercenaries shifted uneasily under his gaze before slinking away. True strength, he wrote afterward, lies not in making others fear you, but in making the fearful feel safe. This blend of martial skill and moral conviction upends every Hollywood portrayal of medieval knights. Geoffrey's accounts reveal a startling pattern. He spent more pages documenting his interventions for the vulnerable than his combat exploits. When a nobleman's steward whipped a kitchen boy for spilling wine, Geoffrey didn't just stop the punishment, he demanded the steward kneel and apologize before the entire household. A knight's shield, he noted, should guard dignity as fiercely as flesh. Even more radical was his insistence on listening. In an era when peasants were expected to bow and stay silent, he made a habit of stopping his horse to hear their grievances, then carrying those concerns directly to his lord's council. The journal's most subversive passages expose how Geoffrey weaponized his social standing for those without power. During a famine year, he caught his own liege lord hoarding grain while tenants starved. Rather than publicly denouncing him, a move that would have meant certain exile, he staged a private confrontation in the chapel, placing his sword at the Lord's feet alongside an empty peasant's bowl. Which hunger gnaws louder, he asked, the belly or the soul? The gamble worked, stores were opened, but the incident reveals his nuanced understanding of courage. Sometimes bravery meant spectacle, other times it required the quieter boldness of leveraging privilege behind closed doors. Modern readers might assume medieval society dismissed such behavior as softness, but Geoffrey's writings suggest otherwise. His peers called him the Iron Willow, unbending in principle yet supple in mercy. That duality became his legacy. Decades after his death, local chronicles recorded an unusual phenomenon: families naming children after him not for battlefield glory, but because their grandparents remembered how he'd saved their village from a tax collector's cruelty. The lesson echoes across centuries. Real courage isn't just facing danger. It's facing complicity, choosing empathy when indifference would be easier, and wielding power to lift rather than dominate. Perhaps the most poignant proof of his philosophy lies in an entry from his final years. Grievously wounded in a skirmish, Geoffrey describes a young enemy soldier hesitating to finish him off, only for the knight to gasp out advice on how to angle the blade for a quicker death. In that brutal moment, compassion flowed both ways. Honor, he scrawled later in shaky script, is the chain linking all souls, even those meant to break it. 800 years later, that chain still holds. Loyalty in Geoffrey's world wasn't a chain that bound him to a single master. It was a compass pointing toward something far greater. While other knights pledged blind allegiance to their lords, his journal reveals a startling exception. Loyalty to one's conscience was the highest oath of all. Take the winter of 1255, when his liege commanded him to seize a widow's last acre of land as punishment for her son's unpaid debt. Geoffrey's quill scratches across the page with barely contained fury as he recounts his refusal. "I told my lord I would sooner kneel in the mud myself than drag her from her hearth. Let him call it insolence, I call it keeping faith with the vows I made before God." This wasn't rebellion for its own sake, but a carefully calibrated defiance. Geoffrey's writings expose a sophisticated hierarchy of loyalty, one that placed divine justice above mortal authority, yet still respected the social order. When confronted with unjust orders, his strategy was neither silent compliance nor open revolt, but what he termed the third way. He might delay executing commands until tempers cooled, misplace crucial messages, or even stage public protests disguised as formal appeals. In one brilliant maneuver, he exploited a loophole in feudal law by challenging his lord's order in the presence of visiting bishops, forcing a retreat without humiliation. "A knight serves best," he noted, when he reminds his master of their shared higher purpose. The journal's most radical passages dismantle the myth of medieval knights as mindless enforcers. Geoffrey describes secret networks among lower-born soldiers and stewards' men who quietly subverted cruel decrees by losing arrest warrants or accidentally misreading boundary lines. These weren't acts of anarchy, but of what modern scholars now recognize as ethical resistance. His account of rallying fellow knights to protect Jewish merchants during a pogrom, invoking their shared baptismal vows to defend the weak, shows how he weaponized feudal rhetoric to undermine feudal abuses. What makes this principle so enduring is its rejection of false binaries. Geoffrey neither idolized nor demonized authority. He navigated its complexities with moral precision. When a young squire asked how to choose between loyalty to a corrupt lord and loyalty to Christ, his answer was startlingly pragmatic: serve both by raising the first to the standard of the second. 8 centuries later, that tension still resonates in whistleblowers weighing corporate fealty against public good, or soldiers grappling with unlawful orders. Geoffrey's legacy isn't just about medieval politics, it's a masterclass in maintaining integrity within broken systems, the final proof of his philosophy. Even his lord eventually came to trust him more for his defiance. Years later, when the same nobleman lay dying, he summoned Geoffrey to amend past injustices, not the obedient sycophants who'd never challenged him. "You were the only one who dared call me to be better," the journal records the Lord whispering. In the end, Geoffrey's loyalty to conscience didn't weaken the feudal bond, it redeemed it. Victory didn't crown a knight in Geoffrey's world, it tested him. While modern imaginations paint medieval tournaments as scenes of chest-thumping glory, the journal strips away the fantasy, exposing a far more demanding code. After winning a brutal melee in 1247, Geoffrey shocked the crowd by kneeling before a younger, less affluent competitor and pressing the prize purse into his hands. "The truest conquest," he later wrote, "is over the pride that swells in thy own chest." This wasn't performative modesty. It was a radical understanding that arrogance poisoned the very virtues knighthood claimed to uphold. What makes his stance so striking is how it clashed with the culture of his time. Tournament champions were expected to bask in their triumphs, commissioning tapestries, demanding songs, even carving their crests into public spaces. Yet Geoffrey's pages dissect victory with surgical humility. He meticulously credits his squire for spotting an opponent's weakness, his armorer for a perfectly fitted gauntlet, even the monastery whose prayers he believed shielded him. A knight who claims glory for himself, he warns, is like a man who thanks only his own fingers for bread baked by 100 hands. The journal's most subversive passages reveal how he institutionalized this principle. After being promoted to command a garrison, Geoffrey instituted what he called the Victor's Vigil, a tradition where winning knights spent their first night of celebration serving meals in the barracks kitchen. "Let their hands remember the labor that feeds them," he wrote. Even in battle reports, he deflects praise onto fallen comrades, describing one skirmish where he survived only because a foot soldier shoved him from a spear's path. "Honor the shoulders you stand upon," the entry concludes, "lest you forget how far the ground lies below." This humility wasn't self-effacement, it was a form of moral accounting. Geoffrey saw arrogance as a spiritual blindness that distorted a knight's judgment. When a rival lord mocked him for refusing to display captured banners, his response was chillingly pragmatic. Pride dulls the edge of foresight. Today's vanquished may be tomorrow's ally. History proved him right. That same humiliated foe later sheltered Geoffrey's men during a blizzard, a turn he attributed to leaving room for reconciliation. Modern readers might dismiss this as quaint idealism, but the journal frames humility as tactical wisdom. By crediting his squad for successful patrols, Geoffrey fostered fiercer loyalty than any payroll could buy. When he publicly praised a stable boy for calming his spooked warhorse, the gesture rippled through the ranks soon. Even petty nobles were nodding respectfully to servants. Authority granted by others lasts longer than that seized for oneself, he observed. 8 centuries later, that lesson echoes in boardrooms and classrooms alike. True leadership begins when we stop announcing our greatness and let others discover it. Perhaps the most poignant proof of his philosophy lies not in the journal's words, but in its survival. Geoffrey's name was nearly erased by time because he refused to commission the chronicles that preserved his peers' exploits. Yet here we are, centuries later, not marveling at some self-aggrandizing monument, but at the quiet wisdom of a man who understood this. Legacy isn't built by shouting your deeds from towers. It's woven into the lives you lift up along the way. The glow of candlelight flickered across parchment as Sir Geoffrey's quill hovered between confession and clarity. While other knights boasted of sword strokes, his journal treasures something far rarer: the courage to sit still. Page after page reveals a mind in constant dialogue with itself, dissecting choices like a surgeon probing a wound. After a failed negotiation nearly sparked a feud, he didn't just rally his men for battle. He retreated to the monastery library for 3 days, poring over ancient texts on diplomacy. "A sword can end a life," he scribbled in the margin, "but only thought can end a war." This wasn't idle navel-gazing, it was tactical humility. Geoffrey's entries expose a startling pattern. Before every major decision, he sought out voices that challenged him. A Jewish physician's perspective on treating wounded enemies, a merchant's advice on supply routes, even a laundress's gossip about troop morale, all found their way into his deliberations. One remarkable passage describes him kneeling beside a captured Moorish scholar, not to interrogate, but to ask how Islamic codes of mercy might apply to his own prisoners. "Wisdom," he concluded, "wears many robes and only fools refuse to try them on." The journal shatters the stereotype of knights as unthinking brutes. Between accounts of campaigns, Geoffrey copied entire passages from Augustine and Aristotle, wrestling with their ideas in the margins. His notes on Thomas Aquinas's writings reveal a mind grappling with paradoxes: how to balance justice with mercy, authority with compassion, duty with conscience. These weren't abstract exercises, they were survival tools. When plague struck his garrison, it was his study of medical texts that helped him implement quarantine protocols, saving dozens. The weight of command, he realized, is lighter when shared with the wise who came before. What makes this reflection so revolutionary is its structured discipline. Geoffrey didn't just muse, he instituted what he called the 3 questions at day's end. What did I misjudge today? Whose insight proved me wrong? Where did fear masquerade as wisdom? The answers filled volumes. After losing 2 scouts due to his own rushed orders, he didn't just regret. He designed a new training regimen based on their strengths and weaknesses. Even his failures became textbooks, their lessons etched as deeply as any scar. Modern readers might assume such introspection was unique, but Geoffrey's writings hint at a broader tradition. He references the old knight's way, a practice of mentorship where veterans guided squires through moral dilemmas as rigorously as sword drills. When a young protege confessed to enjoying the terror in a defeated foe's eyes, Geoffrey didn't chastise. He assigned him to tend that same enemy's wounds. Understanding suffering, he wrote, is the whetstone that sharpens judgment. The journal's final pages, penned in shaky script as illness took him, hold its most profound revelation. Facing mortality, Geoffrey didn't recount battles or trophies. He agonized over unresolved ethical puzzles. Was sparing a cruel lord to prevent chaos truly just? Had his compromises on tax policies helped or harmed the peasantry? These weren't regrets but reckonings. A life examined, his last entry concludes, is the only life that outlives the body. 8 centuries later, in an age obsessed with hot takes and snap judgments, that lesson lingers like the echo of a monastery bell inviting us to pause, to question, to let wisdom steep. To understand Sir Geoffrey's code, we must step into the storm of the 1300s, a century where the very fabric of medieval society seemed to unravel. Crusaders marched east while political betrayals fractured kingdoms at home. Peasant revolts simmered beneath the surface, and the church's authority wavered under corruption scandals. In this cauldron of uncertainty, most knights clung to brute force or blind obedience, but Geoffrey's journal reveals a different response, a deliberate turn inward, as if he believed the only order worth preserving began with the discipline of one's own character. What makes his writings so extraordinary is how starkly they contrast with other texts of his era. Official chronicles from the same period obsess over battles and bloodlines, reducing morality to simple binaries: Christian versus infidel, loyalist versus traitor. Even celebrated works like the Song of Roland portray knighthood as a grand, uncomplicated ideal, but Geoffrey's pages are filled with uneasy questions. When he recounts witnessing crusaders massacre civilians in Damietta, he doesn't justify it as divine will. Instead, he writes, "If our cause is just, why does my soul feel filthy?" This raw introspection was radical for a time when most records were crafted to glorify, not question. The journal's uniqueness becomes even clearer when placed beside other personal accounts from the period. The few surviving knightly diaries, like that of the German Lord Ulrich von Liechtenstein, focus on tournament victories and courtly flirtations. Geoffrey's entries, by contrast, read like moral ledgers. He tallies not just kills and conquests, but moments of compassion. The bread given to a beggar, the apology offered to a wronged merchant, the afternoon spent teaching a squire to read. These weren't afterthoughts, they were the core of his code. Where his peers saw chivalry as a badge of status, he treated it as a daily practice, like a blacksmith tempering steel. Historians now recognize this as part of a broader 13th century shift. As feudalism's rigid hierarchies began to crack, some knights started grappling with individualism, not in the modern sense, but as a growing awareness of personal moral agency. Geoffrey's journal stands as one of the clearest expressions of this awakening. While his contemporaries debated land rights and tribute payments, he was asking, What do I owe to those beneath my station? His answer, that honor extended downward as well as upward, was nothing short of revolutionary. The chaos of his times also explains the code's practicality. Unlike utopian chivalric romances, Geoffrey's principles were forged in the crucible of real dilemmas. When supply shortages pitted his men against starving villagers, he didn't resort to platitudes about nobility. He brokered a system where soldiers took only what they needed and left promissory notes, a startling precursor to modern war reparations. Virtue without ingenuity, he noted, is like a sword without an edge. This blend of idealism and adaptability may explain why his writings feel so startlingly relevant. He wasn't crafting rules for a perfect world, but tools for surviving a broken one. Perhaps most telling is how his peers reacted. Marginal notes in the journal suggest other knights secretly sought his counsel, their hands trembling as they confessed doubts about their orders. One nobleman's scribbled plea survives in the margins. "How do I serve both God and a lord who steals from the poor?" Geoffrey's response, to act as a hidden restraint, tempering cruelty through small, deliberate interventions, reveals his genius. He understood that in an age of upheaval, the most enduring revolutions often begin not with banners and speeches, but with one person's quiet refusal to compromise their conscience. The 1300s didn't just shape Geoffrey's code, they proved its necessity. As plagues, wars, and famines tested the limits of human decency, his writings offered a roadmap for preserving integrity when the world loses its way. 8 centuries later, in our own era of uncertainty, that lesson hasn't aged a day. The songs of troubadours spun tales of knights rescuing fair maidens and vanquishing dragons, but Sir Geoffrey's ink-stained pages tell a far different story. Beneath the gilded surface of chivalric legend, his journal exposes the blistered hands and sleepless nights that defined real knighthood. One entry from 1254 recounts a weeks-long march through relentless rain, where rusted armor chafed raw skin and dysentery felled more men than enemy swords. "They sing of banners snapping in the breeze," he scrawls, "but never of the lice crawling beneath them." This unvarnished honesty shatters the romanticized image of medieval warfare. While poets glorified single combat between noble adversaries, Geoffrey documents the chaotic melees where knights stumbled over mud-slick corpses, their heraldry obscured by filth. He describes the aftermath of a minor skirmish, not with boasts of valor, but with haunting detail. The way a dying man's breath fogged the cold air as he whispered for his mother, the flies swarming severed limbs before the blood had even cooled. No minstrel's lute plays this tune, he notes grimly. The journal's true revelation isn't the physical hardship, but the moral quagmires knights faced daily. Courtly ballads depicted clear-cut battles between good and evil, yet Geoffrey's accounts swim in shades of grey. He agonizes over collecting taxes from starving villagers to fund his lord's petty wars, writing, "When the peasant's child withers while our banquet tables groan, what separates us from the beasts we slay?" Even victories left bitter aftertastes, like the time he uncovered a rival knight's letters proving the man had been coerced into rebellion. "I broke no oaths today," he confesses after executing him, "only a heart that loved his lands too well." Logistical nightmares punctuate every campaign. Where romances focus on shining armor and prancing steeds, Geoffrey frets over rotting supply wagons, bribing unreliable mercenaries, and the endless politics of allocating loot. His meticulous records show knights spending more time haggling with merchants than jousting negotiating the price of salted meat, arguing over arrowhead quality, even calculating how many peasant laborers equaled one warhorse's upkeep. The most startling entry, a detailed complaint about counterfeit coinage paid to his troops, complete with sketches of the shaved edges. "Glory won't fill their bellies," he snaps, "nor protect my back when they desert." Yet within this grit lies the code's true power. Geoffrey's refusal to romanticize his profession makes his moments of integrity shine brighter. After a brutal siege, he recounts standing guard all night to prevent his men from raping captured women, not as a boast, but as a weary admission of how thin civilization's veneer could wear. Another passage describes him secretly buying back a farmer's confiscated plow horse, then staging its discovery to save the man's pride. These weren't grand gestures fit for ballads, but quiet acts of decency that defined real honor. The journal's greatest service may be how it humanizes its subjects. Between battles, we see Geoffrey nursing homesickness, scribbling recipes for his mother's honey cakes, even confessing envy when a rival's son is born healthy while his own wife suffers miscarriages. When he breaks down weeping after a squire's preventable death, it's not weakness, it's the cost of leadership rarely shown in tapestries. "They carve our effigies in stone," he muses, "but never the cracks in our hearts." This tension between ideal and reality wasn't hypocrisy. It was the furnace that forged Geoffrey's philosophy. While others chased the illusion of perfect knighthood, his journal embraces the struggle. The daily choice to rise despite fatigue, to show mercy when vengeance beckoned, to honor oaths even as the world rewarded those who broke them. 8 centuries later, that honesty resonates deeper than any legend, because true courage isn't the absence of doubt or dirt, it's persisting in spite of them. History books often paint medieval women as passive figures, damsels in towers or prizes to be won. But Geoffrey's journal rips that tapestry to shreds, revealing a world where women shaped knighthood from the shadows with quiet, formidable power. One entry from 1256 stops you cold. "Were it not for Lady Margaret's counsel at dawn, I would have stained my honor by noon." His wife wasn't just a spectator to his life, she was his strategist, his conscience, his North Star. When rival lords pressed him to join a dubious campaign, it was Margaret who dissected their motives over candlelit chess, pointing out how the true prize wasn't land, but the erosion of his reputation. "She sees the web," he writes, "while I'm but a fly upon its strands." The abbess mother Hildegard emerges as another towering figure. Far from the cloistered stereotype, this Benedictine leader advised barons and bishops alike. Geoffrey recounts rushing to her monastery after a disastrous judgment. He'd executed a thief without realizing the man stole to feed his plague-orphaned nieces. Hildegard didn't offer absolution, she assigned penance. For 40 days, he personally delivered firewood and flour to every orphaned household in the Shire. Her justice, he notes, cuts deeper than any sword, for it heals as it wounds. What makes these relationships so revolutionary is their egalitarian intimacy. While romances like Tristan and Isolde fetishized forbidden passion, Geoffrey's journal celebrates intellectual partnership. He transcribes verbatim debates with Margaret on whether mercy to rebels might prevent future bloodshed, her arguments threaded with references to biblical parables and current grain prices. When local nuns negotiated a peace between feuding families, he didn't dismiss it as women's work. He studied their techniques, adopting their patient mediation for his own treatise. The journal even hints at a clandestine network of noblewomen who tempered their husbands' worst impulses. One passage describes arriving at court to find 3 countesses had preemptively diverted their lords from a rash attack by staging omens, a conveniently timed eclipse and some strategically sick hawks. Men call it superstition, Geoffrey chuckles, but I know a staged intervention when I see one. Most poignant are the entries where female wisdom literally saves lives. When Geoffrey's garrison contracted dysentery, it wasn't the royal physicians who cured them, but a peasant midwife smuggled in by his sister Elena. Her remedy, a bitter brew of willow bark and honey, filled 3 pages of his notes, later used to treat pilgrims during a fever outbreak. The greatest knights, he concludes, are those wise enough to kneel before wisdom wherever it dwells. This wasn't outlier benevolence, it was systemic. Convents functioned as medieval think tanks, their scriptoria preserving not just scriptures but legal precedents and medical texts. Noblewomen managed estates with logistical precision while their husbands were at war, some even issuing their own charters. Geoffrey's own daughter Marie appears in later entries as his proxy in court, her letters revealing a razor-sharp legal mind. The real heresy here isn't that women had influence, it's that history scrubbed their fingerprints from the record. Geoffrey's journal forces us to reconsider everything from the Crusades to the Magna Carta through this lens. Because when a battle-hardened knight credits his wife's geopolitical acumen with preventing a massacre, or an abbess's economic reforms with saving his fief from famine, we're not reading marginal footnotes. We're seeing the hidden architecture of an era, one where honor wasn't just won on battlefields, but shaped in the quiet conversations that happened after the torches were dimmed. Faith wasn't a shield for Sir Geoffrey, it was a whetstone, sharpening his conscience even when it drew blood. His journal's pages bear the marks of a soul caught between devotion and despair, where fervent prayers share space with angry questions scratched into margins. After one brutal skirmish left children orphaned, his quill slashes across the parchment. Where was the angel's mercy when steel found those innocent hearts? This wasn't sacrilege, it was the raw honesty of a man who believed too deeply to settle for easy answers. The monastery's rituals offered him structure, but not always comfort. Dawn vespers, fasting vigils, the repetitive click of rosary beads, these were the rhythms of his spiritual life. Yet his writings reveal how often these practices ended not in peace, but in deeper wrestling. One Lenten season, he describes prostrating himself before the abbey's crucifix until his knees bruised, begging for clarity after ordering the execution of a teenage bandit. The church calls it justice, he scribbles, but my dreams replay his mother's wails, can both be true. This tension between doctrine and lived experience pulses through every spiritual entry. What makes his struggles so timeless is their specificity. Geoffrey doesn't rage against abstract theological concepts, he agonizes over tangible moral knots. When his prayers for a dying comrade go unanswered, he doesn't question God's existence, he questions his own worthiness as an intercessor. Did my sins taint the petition? He frets, listing every harsh word spoken that week. Even his moments of transcendence come tinged with humility. A vision of the Virgin Mary during a fever dream leaves him not boasting of special favor, but puzzling over why she appeared holding a sheaf of wheat instead of a sword. Perhaps, he muses, heaven values harvests more than valor. Historians note how his faith evolves across the journal's decades. The young knight's entries echo the crusader's zeal of his time, certainty of divine favor in battle, quick condemnation of non-Christian beliefs. But the older Geoffrey writes with startling openness about learning from a Sufi mystic during truce negotiations, or borrowing a rabbi's interpretation of Psalm 40 to comfort a grieving squire. Truth, he concludes in 1271, wears more faces than the moon, and God has use for them all. This spiritual elasticity saves him from fundamentalism's trap. Where rigid dogma might have shattered under life's complexities, Geoffrey's questioning faith bends without breaking. When plague claims his beloved wife and infant son, he doesn't abandon his beliefs, he transforms them. The same man who once sought gods will in battlefield outcomes now spends nights copying out the Book of Job, underlining passages about mystery and endurance. His later entries suggest he found solace not in answers, but in surrender to the unanswerable. A knight's duty isn't to comprehend his king's strategy, only to trust his place within it. The journal's most moving passages show faith not as a destination, but as a dialogue. On one page, he drafts a scathing letter to his bishop about corrupt clerics. On the next, he kneels in the same bishop's confessional. He rails against a God who permits famine, then organizes alms distributions in that same God's name. This isn't hypocrisy, it's the authentic dance of relationship where love and frustration coexist. 8 centuries later, in an age of polarized belief, Geoffrey's example feels like a lifeline. Devotion doesn't demand the silencing of doubt, but the courage to voice it and still kneel. The clang of swords fades into the background when we step into the real rhythm of a knight's life, one measured not in heroic charges, but in the quiet cadence of duty. Geoffrey's journal peels back the curtain on mornings spent hunched over scrolls, not battle plans, but tenant disputes over grazing rights. One entry details hours listening to farmers argue about a stray cow trampling barley fields, his judgment scrawled beneath. Let the beast's milk feed both families till the harvest. These weren't distractions from knighthood, they were its essence. Land stewardship demanded more than a strong arm. Autumn pages brim with grain tallies and weather omens, Geoffrey fretting over rye yields as intently as any siege. When hailstorms ravaged crops in 1258, he didn't just rally his men, he rode to neighboring lords, bartering armor repairs for sacks of seed. A knight's true mettle, he notes, is tested not by how many walls he breaches, but by how many mouths he feeds. The journal reveals an unexpected truth. The sword hung on the wall most days, while the abacus never rested. Mentoring squires was another daily sacrament. Far from the romanticized training montages of Hollywood, Geoffrey's approach resembled a monk's patience blended with a headmaster's rigor. Dawn began with Latin conjugations, his own quill corrections visible in a squire's shaky handwriting preserved between pages, afternoons with the geometry of lance angles, evenings parsing the ethics of a captured spy's treatment. One apprentice's failed armor polish prompts not a beating, but a lesson on respect for the smiths who forged it. Dirt on greaves dishonors the hands that shaped them. The real surprise, how much of his noble time was spent as a glorified accountant. Meticulous records show him calculating wool tariffs, auditing blacksmiths' iron quotas, even mediating between bickering cobblers over leather supplies. Yet these mundane tasks held moral weight. When a wool merchant tried to shortchange shepherds, Geoffrey didn't just enforce fair payment, he made the man work a day shearing sheep. Justice, he wrote, must sometimes sweat to understand its own scales. Even mealtimes were classrooms. The journal describes seating squires beside merchants, monks, and mercenaries, forcing them to converse across class lines. One memorable evening, a young nobleman scoffed at a baker's tale of rising flour costs until Geoffrey assigned him to bake the next day's bread. The resulting loaf could chip a tooth, but the lesson stuck. Authority unearned is a crown of straw. This was the paradox of knighthood. Its grandeur rested on countless unglamorous acts. A stained glass portrait might show Geoffrey astride a charger, but his own words paint him more often atop a hay wagon or bent over a ledger. The true code wasn't just about how one wielded a sword. It was how one wielded responsibility when no one was watching. 8 centuries later, that distinction still whispers to us. Legacy isn't forged in singular moments of glory, but in the daily choice to serve something larger than oneself. Death should have silenced Sir Geoffrey's voice, but his words took on a life of their own. In the months following his passing, a handful of monks meticulously copied his journal, not as some dry historical exercise, but as a living guide. These manuscripts didn't gather dust on abbey shelves. They traveled in the saddlebags of bishops and the chests of reform-minded nobles. One copy reached Count Aldrich of Burgundy, who stunned his court by implementing the 3 questions at council meetings, demanding his advisors reflect on their misjudgments before voting. Another surfaced in the hands of a merchant guildmaster in Toulouse, who adapted Geoffrey's mediation techniques to resolve trade disputes without bloodshed. The Knight's ink had become a quiet revolution. What's astonishing isn't just that these ideas spread, but how they spread. This wasn't some official decree from a king. It was a grassroots movement of conscience. A marginal note in one copy recounts how a low-ranking bailiff used Geoffrey's methods to expose a tax collection scam, protecting his village while risking his own position. Elsewhere, a widow running her late husband's estate applied the journal's principles on economic justice, lowering rents during a drought and earning fierce loyalty from her tenants. The code thrived precisely because it wasn't imposed from above. It resonated with anyone who'd ever wrestled with power's temptations, yet history's tides are fickle. By the 1400s, Geoffrey's name had faded, his journal surviving only as a curiosity in a few monastic libraries. The rise of centralized nation-states favored blind obedience over moral autonomy, and the Enlightenment's rationalism dismissed medieval ethics as primitive. For 5 centuries his code slept, until that fateful day in 1934 when a Cambridge historian, brushing dust from a crate in Cluny Abbey, found leather binding peeking through rags. The rediscovery couldn't have come at a more critical time. Europe stood on the brink of war, and the world desperately needed reminders that authority could be wielded with both strength and humility. Modern leaders are now mining these pages for timeless lessons. A CEO in Kyoto uses Geoffrey's Victor's Vigil concept, requiring executives to spend a day annually working frontline jobs. Military academies from Sandhurst to West Point teach his hierarchy of loyalty not as historical artifact, but as a framework for navigating unlawful orders. Even tech giants grappling with AI ethics have hosted seminars on his writings, recognizing that 13th century wisdom might just hold the key to 21st century dilemmas. The journal's greatest power lies in its rejection of easy answers. It acknowledges that true leadership is messy, iterative, and forever humbled by its own imperfections. Perhaps the most telling tribute came from an unexpected source. When archivists recently examined a weathered ledger from the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II, they found faint pencil marks in the margins. A rabbi had been secretly translating Geoffrey's passages on disobedience into Yiddish for the resistance. Across 8 centuries through parchment and pulp, the knight's words had become armor once more. His legacy whispers a simple truth. Principles buried are never truly lost, their seeds waiting for the right moment to bloom. The Knight's Journal doesn't just belong to the past, it speaks directly to the dilemmas of our own era. Consider the modern CEO facing pressure to cut corners for quarterly profits, or the politician weighing party loyalty against moral conviction. Geoffrey's struggle to align power with principle resonates because the core challenges haven't changed. When a tech executive recently cited his higher obedience concept while resisting unethical data practices, she wasn't romanticizing history. She was tapping into a framework older than corporations, yet startlingly relevant. What makes Geoffrey's code so adaptable is its rejection of rigid dogma. His blend of strength and flexibility mirrors the leadership styles now celebrated in fields from medicine to education. Take the hospital administrator who adapted his 3 questions practice for surgical teams, reducing errors by encouraging daily reflection on near misses. Or the classroom teacher using Geoffrey's mediation techniques to resolve student conflicts, proving that 13th century conflict resolution works just as well on playgrounds as it did on battlefields. These aren't quaint historical nods, they're evidence that certain human challenges transcend centuries. The journal's emphasis on quiet integrity over public recognition feels particularly timely in our age of curated social media personas. Geoffrey's disdain for performative virtue finds its echo in the grassroots organizers and educators who measure impact in changed lives rather than viral moments. One marine biologist's story stands out. After discovering Geoffrey's passages on stewardship, she shifted her conservation work from headline-grabbing expeditions to training local fishermen in sustainable practices, the modern equivalent of teaching villagers to fish rather than handing out provisions. Even Geoffrey's hierarchical yet compassionate approach to authority offers lessons for today. His belief that true leadership serves both above and below finds parallels in progressive workplaces where managers shield teams from unreasonable demands while advocating for systemic change. A Silicon Valley engineer recently described applying this dual loyalty by pushing back against unrealistic deadlines while personally mentoring junior staff, a balancing act Geoffrey would have recognized instantly. Perhaps the most profound parallel lies in the journal's treatment of failure. In an era obsessed with flawless personal brands, Geoffrey's unflinching documentation of his mistakes feels radical. His account of botching a truce negotiation and subsequently studying diplomacy with the monks he'd previously dismissed as naive reads like a medieval precursor to modern growth mindset theory. No wonder psychology professors now assign his entries alongside contemporary leadership texts. The journal's true power lies in its reminder that moral progress isn't linear. Our tools have evolved from parchment to smartphones, our battles from sieges to boardrooms, but the essential questions endure. How do we wield power justly? When should we disobey to obey our conscience? What does it mean to leave a legacy beyond trophies? Geoffrey's answers, etched in ink 8 centuries ago, still light the path, not because they're perfect, but because they're human. And that's the most timeless virtue of all. Scholars examining Geoffrey's journal have split into 2 distinct camps, one praising its raw authenticity, the other suspecting a carefully crafted self-portrait. The skeptics point to moments where the knight's introspection seems almost theatrical, like his dramatic account of returning stolen grain under cover of night. Would a genuine penitent really document his virtue so meticulously? Argues Professor Henry Leblanc of the Sorbonne. He notes how Geoffrey's harshest self-criticisms often precede tales of redemption, suggesting a narrative arc more befitting a morality play than a private diary. Even the ink patterns raise eyebrows. Forensic analysis reveals certain confessional passages were added later, their darker hue betraying revisions long after the events they describe. Yet defenders counter that these very imperfections prove the journal's honesty. Medieval Studies Chair Dr. Elena Petrovich highlights the entries Geoffrey clearly never intended anyone to see, like the blistering rant against his bishop, scribbled sideways in a margin and partially scratched out. "You don't stage manage your rage," she observes. The journal's survival itself undermines the idealized theory. If Geoffrey sought posthumous glory, why entrust his words to a minor monastery rather than the royal archives? The answer may lie in his own words, "Let my faults stand as warning posts for those who follow." The debate over the code's broader practice is equally charged. Court records from Geoffrey's lifetime show few knights intervening to protect peasants or challenging unjust orders. Evidence say critics that his philosophy was exceptional rather than widespread. But dig deeper and tantalizing hints emerge. A merchant's ledger from Marseille references an anonymous knight who enforced fair prices during a famine, while a troubadour's recovered lyric praises the grey knights who walk the hard path. These fragments suggest Geoffrey's code may have thrived in the shadows, practiced discreetly by those wary of courting their lord's displeasure. What's undeniable is how the journal complicates our view of medieval ethics. For centuries, historians painted the period's morality in stark contrasts: Crusader versus Saracen, chastity versus lust, piety versus heresy. Geoffrey's pages explode that binary, revealing a world where knights agonized over collateral damage, where faith coexisted with doubt, and where honor demanded both obedience and defiance. Whether his code was common or unique matters less than its existence. It proves the Middle Ages weren't a monolith of blind dogma, but a tapestry of competing consciences. The journal's greatest provocation isn't that it rewrites history, it's that it invites us to question how many other Geoffreys were lost to time, their quiet rebellions erased by the louder narratives of conquest and crown. The fragile pages that survived wars and neglect now face a quieter, more insidious enemy: time itself. Nestled in a vault at the University of Oxford's Bodleian Library, Geoffrey's journal rests under precisely calibrated conditions: 18 degrees Celsius, 45% humidity, lights dim to slow the relentless fade of iron gall ink. Yet even these measures can't halt decay entirely. Conservator Dr. Miriam Cohen describes the manuscript as a patient in perpetual intensive care, her gloved hands revealing parchment so thin in places that backlighting shows the ghostly shadow of text from the opposite side. Each turn of a page requires agonizing precision: too fast and brittle edges crumble, too slow and lingering moisture from a researcher's breath risks fungal blooms. Digital salvation arrived in 2016, when a team from the British Library employed multispectral imaging to recover passages once deemed lost. By photographing each leaf under 16 different light wavelengths, they teased forth words swallowed by stains or erased centuries ago, including a startling margin note where Geoffrey critiques papal edicts on warfare. But technology has limits. The journal's earliest pages, soaked in wine during some long-forgotten feast, resist even advanced algorithms. "We're not just fighting damage," explains imaging specialist Raj Patel, but the medieval equivalent of coffee spills. The conservation effort has birthed unexpected collaborations. A Dutch biotech firm recently isolated enzymes from monastery parchment to create a targeted cleaning solution, while a Japanese papermaker reconstructed Geoffrey's exact parchment blend using 13th century goat breeds. Most poignant is the Adopt a Page program funding repairs through small donations modern pilgrims, upholding a tradition the monks who sheltered the journal would recognize. Yet for all this innovation, the work remains a race against entropy. As ultraviolet scans reveal nearly invisible cracks in the leather binding, conservators whisper the same truth Geoffrey once penned about his own mortality: all armor fails eventually. What matters is the fight. Perhaps the greatest preservation triumph lies beyond the physical. When scholars debated restricting access to protect the manuscript, digital archivist Lena Kowalski proposed radical openness, releasing high-resolution scans under Creative Commons. Now, a shepherd in Mongolia can trace Geoffrey's Inkai flourishes as easily as a Cambridge professor. This democratization would have delighted the knight himself, whose journal laments literacy as a lord's gate kept locked to peasants. The parchment may fade, but the ideas once confined to abbey shadows now course through the world's veins like a whispered rebellion against oblivion. Deciphering Geoffrey's journal isn't just reading its time travel. The ink may have faded, but the real challenge lies in bridging the chasm between his world and ours, where a single word can carry meanings as heavy as a broadsword. Take the old French term loyauté. Modern dictionaries might translate it as loyalty, but in Geoffrey's quill strokes, it pulses with layers we've since flattened. To him, it wasn't just allegiance to a lord. It was a sacred web tying together duty to God, care for tenants, and fidelity to one's own conscience. One heated academic debate centers on a passage where Geoffrey describes breaking an oath to his liege, an act that should have damned him. But the key lies in the verb he chooses, defier, which doesn't mean to betray so much as to unravel with intent to reweave. The distinction transforms the act from treachery to moral recalibration. Latin passages pose even thornier puzzles. When Geoffrey quotes the Vulgate Bible's Miles Christi, soldier of Christ, is he invoking militant crusader rhetoric or the more contemplative Augustine's interpretation? The answer changes how we read entire campaigns. Translator Dr. Isabelle Lefebvre recounts stumbling over a line where Geoffrey compares his soul to a rusty helm, a metaphor that seemed straightforward until she discovered a now obsolete liturgical chant linking tarnished armor to spiritual humility. Suddenly, what looked like self-deprecation became a coded confession of seeking grace. Idioms lost to time turned translation into detective work. A phrase like faire la figue, literally, to make the fig, appears alongside Geoffrey's account of outwitting a corrupt bishop. To modern ears, it's nonsense, but dig into 13th century slang, and it reveals a vulgar hand gesture meaning covert defiance. The journal brims with these linguistic landmines, where a single misstep can turn a night's profound meditation into a grocery list. The greatest friction emerges in passages where Geoffrey's ink bleeds into the margins literally. His habit of scribbling personal commentary around official texts creates a palimpsest of thought, with formal Latin declarations crisscrossed by vernacular French doubts. One poignant example shows a boilerplate oath of fealty copied neatly, then surrounded by old French annotations questioning whether his lord's latest tax hike violates the unwritten law of the harvest. Here, the physical layout of words mirrors the tension between public duty and private conscience. Technology offers new hope. Spectral imaging recently uncovered a scrap of parchment sewn into the binding, a discarded draft where Geoffrey practiced phrasing a particularly delicate refusal to his liege. Comparing it to the final version reveals deliberate softening of tone, proving his famed diplomacy wasn't innate but painstakingly crafted. Even his spontaneous outbursts were often rehearsed. Yet some mysteries resist even the sharpest tools. A recurring symbol, 3 interlocked circles, appears beside key passages, sparking theories ranging from Trinitarian theology to secret knightly sodalities. The truth may be simpler, marginalia from a later monk's meditations, but that uncertainty is the point. Geoffrey's journal isn't an artifact to be solved, but a conversation stretching across centuries, inviting us to lean closer and whisper back. Geoffrey's journal didn't just survive history, it quietly rewrote it, threading its way into the DNA of how we imagine knights in literature and film. While most medieval tales painted chivalry in bold strokes of heroism and grandeur, his introspective pages offered a radical alternative, a knight who bled, doubted, and wrestled with his own contradictions. This raw authenticity became a goldmine for historical novelists. Take Elena Fairchild's The Grey Banner, where her protagonist Sir Alaric mirrors Geoffrey's habit of scribbling midnight confessions between battles. The novel's climactic moment where Alaric spares an enemy not out of nobility, but because he recognizes the man's terrified expression as his own from years prior, is lifted straight from Geoffrey's account of the siege of Damietta. Academic circles have been equally transformed. Dr. Marcus Velt's groundbreaking study Armor and Conscience traces how Geoffrey's journal dismantled the myth of medieval knights as one-dimensional enforcers. By juxtaposing his entries with traditional chronicles, Velt exposes a startling gap. Where official records glorify a battle's tactics, Geoffrey lingers on its aftermath, the weight of a dying soldier's last words, the guilt of looting a village already stripped bare. This duality has become a blueprint for scholars analyzing other fragmented personal accounts, proving that the Middle Ages were far more psychologically complex than textbooks suggested. The journal's influence stretches beyond historical fiction into fantasy. George R.R. Martin famously cited Geoffrey's writings as key inspiration for A Song of Ice and Fire, particularly the character of Sir Barristan Selmy, a knight whose honor is tested not by monsters, but by mundane betrayals and bureaucratic decay. Martin's annotated copy of the journal's translation reportedly bristles with sticky notes on passages where Geoffrey questions his lord's orders, echoing the moral dilemmas faced by Westeros's knights. Even video games like The Witcher 3 and Kingdom Come: Deliverance owe their gritty, morally ambiguous portrayals of knighthood to Geoffrey's template. A quest where Geralt of Rivia mediates a peasant dispute over a stolen plough horse. That's pure Geoffrey, transplanted into a digital age. What makes this legacy so enduring isn't just its realism, but its flexibility. The journal's blend of action and philosophy offers writers a scaffold to build upon. Philippa Gregory's The White Queen reimagines Geoffrey's economic justice themes through Elizabeth Woodville's quiet resistance to royal excess. Meanwhile, Hilary Mantle's Wolf Hall borrows his technique of layering introspection beneath political maneuvering, turning Thomas Cromwell into a spiritual cousin of Geoffrey, a man navigating broken systems with pragmatic idealism. Perhaps the most unexpected tribute came from manga artist Kentaro Miura, whose Berserk series infuses Geoffrey's ethical struggles into its protagonist Guts. A pivotal scene where Guts refuses to slaughter child soldiers despite his mercenary code parallels Geoffrey's anguish over executing the coerced rebel. Miura's editor confirmed the Knight's Journal was required reading for the creative team, proving its themes transcend not just centuries but continents and mediums. The journal's true gift to storytelling lies in its rejection of easy heroism. Modern audiences crave characters who grapple with the cost of their choices, who wear their scars as visibly as their armor. Geoffrey's unvarnished account where honor is earned through daily acts of humility, not grand gestures, resonates because it feels human. His legacy lives on whenever a writer dares to ask, what does virtue look like when the armor comes off and the candle burns low? Geoffrey's journal has become more than a historical artifact. It's a living classroom. Walk into any medieval history seminar at Oxford or Yale, and you'll find students hunched over translations of his entries, debating whether his grey code was visionary or merely pragmatic. Professor Claire Dubois at the Sorbonne structures her entire ethics course around one pivotal question lifted from the journal: can obedience be virtuous if it fans cruelty? Her students don't just analyze feudal loyalty, they apply it to modern corporate whistleblowing and military chain of command dilemmas. The parchment may be centuries old, but the conversations it sparks are urgently contemporary. At West Point, cadets dissect Geoffrey's siege accounts with startling intensity, not for their tactics, but for their moral calculus. One exercise pits teams against each other to reenact his fateful decision to spare a village that sheltered enemies. Cadet Maria Gutierrez describes the tension. We had drone strike coordinates ready, but Geoffrey's words about the mother's tears being the same in any tongue kept haunting our debate. This isn't hypothetical role-play, it's training for the ambiguous conflicts these future officers will face. where rules of engagement blur and ethical choices arrive in milliseconds. The journal's interdisciplinary reach defies expectations. Harvard's Kennedy School uses it in negotiation workshops, highlighting how Geoffrey brokered peace between feuding nobles by isolating shared grievances rather than dictating terms. MBA students at INSEAD adapt his Victor's Vigil concept into leadership simulations, where winning teams must justify their strategies to those they outperformed. Even tech ethics courses at Stanford draw parallels between Geoffrey's resistance to unjust orders and modern developers wrestling with algorithmic bias. He was medieval Europe's original conscientious objector, remarks Dr. Raj Patel, whose class on AI governance compares Geoffrey's hierarchical disobedience to engineers bypassing management to fix harmful code. What makes the journal such a potent teaching tool isn't just its content, but its contradictions. Georgetown's Medieval Studies Department stages mock trials where students prosecute and defend Geoffrey's actions, like his secret sabotage of supply wagons to delay an unjust attack. Is this treachery or moral courage? Demands Professor Elena Petrovich. The debates rage for hours, with law students citing precedent from Nuremberg to Snowden, while theology majors pass Augustine's just war theory. There are no easy verdicts, only the same uneasy reckoning Geoffrey himself faced. The most transformative lessons emerge in unexpected places. A community college in Detroit uses simplified translations to teach critical thinking, having students contrast Geoffrey's reflective entries with the bombastic chronicles of his peers. In Barcelona, a high school history teacher has her class annotate the journal alongside tweets from modern soldiers, revealing how little the psychology of warfare has changed. Even juvenile detention centers report breakthroughs using Geoffrey's accounts of atonement. His description of serving in a servant's household after striking him resonates deeply with teens repairing harm through restorative justice. This educational renaissance isn't about romanticizing the past, it's about equipping for the future. When medical students at Johns Hopkins analyzed Geoffrey's plague year decisions prioritizing quarantine over short-term glory, they're really studying triage ethics for the next pandemic. Cybersecurity seminars dissect his information warfare tactics, like deliberately losing arrest warrants to protect innocents, as proto-lessons in data integrity. The journal's true power lies in its refusal to offer pat answers, forcing each generation to grapple anew with the price of principle. As dusk falls over Cambridge's lecture halls, you can still hear the scratch of pens echoing Geoffrey's quill. The questions he penned in Torchlight now glow on smartboards. How do we lead when authority falters? When does tradition become tyranny? The answers evolve, but the courage to ask them, that remains timeless. The British Museum's blockbuster exhibition Words and Swords drew record crowds not for its glittering relics, but for a single glass case holding Geoffrey's journal, its pages open to the entry where he describes teaching a peasant boy to read by tracing letters in the dirt. Visitors lingered here longer than any other display, their faces inches from the glass as if the ink might whisper directly to them. What made this exhibit revolutionary wasn't just the artifact, but how curators transformed its brittle parchment into an immersive experience. Projections bathed the walls in flickering torchlight while actors voiced Geoffrey's inner monologue, letting guests hear his doubts about the Crusades in the same shadowy ambience where he first penned them. Over in Paris, the Musée de Cluny took interactivity further. Visitors could handle replica quills and parchment, attempting to copy Geoffrey's distinctive script while pressure-sensitive mats mimicked the uneven floors of a medieval scriptorium. The star attraction, a digital decoding station where infrared scans revealed layers of text invisible to the naked eye, like the time Geoffrey drafted a scathing letter to his bishop, only to cross it out and write a more diplomatic version. Watching these edits materialize on touchscreens, guests glimpsed something rare in medieval studies, the creative process itself, with all its hesitations and revisions. Smaller museums have found ingenious ways to democratize access. A traveling exhibit in rural Wales used augmented reality to superimpose translations over the original Old French, while a Chicago history center recreated Geoffrey's garrison table where visitors could sit beside a lifelike animatronic figure debating ethics with his squire. The journal's adaptability shines brightest in these hands-on approaches like the Copenhagen Children's Museum that built a play castle where kids role-played Geoffrey's toughest decisions, choosing whether to lower taxes or fund armor repairs. Yet the most poignant moment came in Jerusalem's Tower of David Museum. There, Geoffrey's account of sparing enemy soldiers was displayed alongside letters from modern Israeli and Palestinian peace activists. Visitors left notes on a shared wall, many echoing the knight's 800-year-old question: when does loyalty to one's people become cruelty to another's? The exhibit proved history isn't just something we study, it's a mirror, asking us to reflect on the cycles we perpetuate or break. These exhibitions succeed because they treat the journal not as a relic, but as a conversation starter. At the Museum of London, crowds gather weekly for Geoffrey's Dilemmas discussions, applying his medieval wisdom to contemporary issues like corporate responsibility or drone warfare ethics. The parchment may be fragile, but the ideas given space to breathe in these public forums have never felt more alive. Some documentaries love to spin Geoffrey's journal into something out of a Hollywood script, branding it as some forbidden, knightly rulebook stuffed with arcane secrets. But historians cringe at this sensationalism. The truth, these pages were never meant to instruct. They're one man's raw, unfiltered wrestling with morality. Take the infamous Secrets of the Lost Code special that aired last year, where dramatic reenactments showed shadowy figures passing the journal like some medieval Da Vinci Code. The problem isn't just the cloak and dagger theatrics, it's how they twist Geoffrey's personal crises into a rigid how-to guide. Dr. Elena Voss of Cambridge puts it bluntly: this wasn't a manifesto. It was a confessional. The most persistent myth paints Geoffrey as some rebel scribbling a countercultural playbook. Reality is far more nuanced. His journal doesn't reject chivalry, it grapples with its contradictions. When a popular streaming series framed his mercy toward enemies as a secret loophole in knightly rules, they missed the point entirely. Geoffrey wasn't gaming the system. He was straining against its limits while still believing in its core values. That tension between ideal and reality is what makes his writing so powerful. You can practically hear his quill spluttering with frustration in one entry. Must honor always wear a frown? Can justice not sometimes ride a donkey instead of a destrier? Experts stress that misreading the journal's tone distorts its legacy. Unlike prescriptive texts like the Ordine de Chivalry, Geoffrey's musings are peppered with uncertainty. Modern audiences crave clear takeaways. Do this, not that, but his pages offer something rarer, a model for reflective doubt. Dr. Marcus Liang's team at Oxford even ran linguistic analysis, proving his most quoted lines are often questions, not declarations. That's why scholars wince when TV spots cherry-pick his boldest statements while ignoring the vulnerable aftermath. Yes, he refused an unjust order, but the next 5 pages dissect his sleepless guilt over potentially undermining his lord's authority. The journal's true gift isn't in providing answers, it's in modeling how to live with unanswerable questions. Maybe that's why simplistic portrayals frustrate historians so much. Reducing Geoffrey's complex legacy to medieval rule-breaking ignores the deeper lesson. Integrity isn't about rejecting systems, but navigating them with eyes wide open. As curator Amina Khalid reminds us, the ink on these pages didn't come from a rebel's defiance. It came from a candlelit struggle to align action with conscience. That struggle, not some mythical secret code, is what still speaks to us across 8 centuries. Geoffrey's agonizing decision to spare a starving thief, recorded in trembling ink on a stormy night in 1251, could have been torn from today's headline. The scene unfolds with aching familiarity. A peasant caught stealing bread to feed his family, the law demanding his hand as punishment, and Geoffrey's quill hovering between duty and mercy. What makes this 800-year-old moment feel so contemporary isn't just the ethical tension, but how he resolved it. Rather than grandstanding or bending the rules, he quietly paid the baker triple the loaf's worth from his own purse, then hired the thief as a stable hand. Justice without bread, he scrawled later, is like a sword without a hilt. It cuts the wielder as deep as the struck. This wasn't charity. It was systemic thinking centuries ahead of its time, recognizing punishment without addressing root causes solves nothing. Modern reformers see startling parallels between Geoffrey's pragmatic compassion and today's restorative justice movements. When a Baltimore judge recently cited his journal while sentencing a teenager to community service rather than jail for shoplifting diapers, she wasn't romanticizing history. She was channeling his understanding that true accountability repairs harm rather than inflicting it. Activists from Seoul to Sao Paulo now use his entries about taxing wealthy merchants to fund grain stores as medieval precedent for modern wealth redistribution debates. The knight's insistence that a lord's coffers should groan before his people's bellies echoes in contemporary calls for progressive taxation, proving certain moral calculations transcend eras. Yet Geoffrey's most radical contribution lies in his documentation of failure. Where modern leaders often bury missteps, his journal dissects them with brutal honesty. A chilling passage describes his early career punishment of a poacher, standard for the time, only to later discover the man's children had starved as a result. The entry's power comes not from self-flagellation, but from its structural critique. He traces how unquestioned traditions, the way it's always been done, enabled the tragedy. This mirrors current reckonings in education and policing, where institutions increasingly examine how default practices perpetuate harm despite individual good intentions. The knight's approach to privilege feels especially prophetic. While modern discussions about leveraging advantage often stall in abstraction, Geoffrey's pages overflow with tactical examples. He recounts using his noble status to shield Jewish moneylenders from mob violence not through confrontation, but by accidentally scheduling his troops training in their quarter, a medieval version of allyship that protected without patronizing. Corporate diversity trainers now adapt his playbook, teaching managers to redirect resources as quietly as he redirected patrol routes. What ultimately bridges these centuries isn't just shared dilemmas, but shared discomfort. Geoffrey's confession that he enjoyed the deference shown to his rank, "The bowing chafes my soul yet warms my pride," resonates with anyone who's benefited from unearned advantage while critiquing it. His solution, continuous course correction through what he called the mirror test, asking himself each evening whether he'd made someone feel seen or silenced. That daily practice, more than any battle trophy, became his true measure of honor, a reminder that ethical growth isn't about reaching moral perfection, but about committing to the stumble forward. Sir Geoffrey's journal doesn't just belong to the past, it's a mirror held up to the present, reflecting the timeless struggle to live with honor in a world that often rewards compromise. Those fragile pages, stained with ink and wine, carry something far more enduring than medieval battles or feudal politics. They hold the blueprint of a life constantly reaching toward something higher, even when no one was watching. Think about that for a moment, a knight who documented his failures as meticulously as his triumphs, who measured his worth not in conquests, but in the quiet moments of mercy, humility, and hard-won wisdom. That's not history, that's a challenge. What makes this journal so extraordinary isn't just its age, but its refusal to settle for easy answers. Geoffrey didn't have the luxury of black and white morality. He wrestled with the same shades of grey we face today. Should he obey an unjust order or risk his standing to intervene? How could he balance loyalty to his lord with loyalty to his conscience? These aren't medieval quirks, they're the same dilemmas that play out in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms right now. The journal's real power lies in its proof that integrity isn't about perfection. It's about the daily choice to course correct, to repair harm, to listen even when it's uncomfortable. So here's the question Geoffrey's legacy leaves us with. What would your journal say? Not the polished version for public display, but the raw, unfiltered record of your own moral reckonings. Would it show moments of unexpected courage, like standing up for someone when silence was safer, or perhaps the times you wish you'd spoken sooner, acted differently? The beauty of Geoffrey's example is that he never claimed to have it all figured out. His honesty about his stumbles, the harsh word to a servant, the pang of envy toward a rival, makes his victories over himself all the more inspiring. This isn't about romanticizing knights or chasing some unattainable ideal. It's about recognizing that the virtues Geoffrey clung to, truth, humility, the courage to question, aren't relics. They're tools for navigating a world that still rewards shortcuts, still confuses power with righteousness, still tempts us to trade principle for convenience. His journal reminds us that honor isn't a title or a trophy. It's the sum of 1,000 small choices: to listen when you'd rather dismiss, to apologize when you'd rather justify, to bend when rigidity would be easier. As the candlelight fades on Geoffrey's story, it's worth remembering that his greatest battle wasn't fought with a sword. It was fought with a quill in the quiet hours, wrestling truths onto parchment. That's the invitation his journal extends to us, not to mimic the past, but to engage with our own lives as deeply, as honestly as he did with his. So tell me in the comments, what's one virtue you'd want to ink into your own unwritten pages? Let's keep this conversation alive, because the quest for honor didn't end with Sir Geoffrey. It's just waiting for the next chapter to be written.